Hi, I'm Jocelyn from the ketoathlete.org. I'm here to share with you today part 2 of my results from my 1-month carnivore experiment. This is all of my blood work data. So just a little bit of background on me. My name's Jocelyn. I'm 36 years old. I'm married. I have 2 kids. I've been doing CrossFit since 2008, and I've been following a cyclic ketogenic diet since January of 2017. From the start of January of 2020 to the middle of February, I followed a meat-only carnivore diet comprised mainly of red meat and eggs, a little bit of chicken and fish in there too, but absolutely no plant products, vegetables, fruit, nuts, any fiber whatsoever. In part 1 of my carnivore diet results, I covered all of the other things, including cravings, health, how my energy levels felt, my digestion, what happened to my body weight, blood glucose data from a continuous glucose monitor I was wearing in my arm, blood ketones, resting heart rate numbers, heart rate variability, and sleep data, all from my Oura Ring. So what follows now in part 2 is all of the blood work that I had done at the end of this experiment. So we'll start first with the electrolytes, sodium, potassium, all that stuff. It was all perfectly normal. Sometimes electrolytes can go out of balance in the first few weeks of a ketogenic diet or a very low carb diet. But since I've been doing this for more than 3 years, that stuff was all fine. Iron, my iron is perfectly normal, which is great for a female of my age. My ferritin was high. It's a marker of stored iron. The main thing they recommend if you have a high ferritin level is phlebotomy. So as soon as I saw my results there, I booked an appointment to donate blood, which I did a couple weeks ago. So I'm happy to have good, healthy blood that I can continue to make regular blood donations. Other nutrient stuff, my B12, right bang in the middle of the normal range. This is awesome as far as I'm concerned. I had some old blood work data from when I was 19 done, and I had low B12 back then. So I'm super happy that the way I eat now means my B12 status is perfectly normal. Vitamin D, also right in the middle of the optimal range, 100 millimolars. This is great too, as this was after spending January and half of February in Canada in the dark and the cold. So that's a great level of vitamin D as far as I'm concerned for a frozen Canadian in the winter. Homocysteine, this was one that I had to request to be tested, and I don't have any, I've never had it tested before, so I don't have a baseline to go off of. But based on my 23andMe data, I did find out that I carry both of the gene mutations in the MTHFR gene, which can lead to elevated homocysteine levels. Homocysteine is involved in methylation, and it relates to all of your B vitamins. So I was just curious to see if my homocysteine would be high, which it's not. It's perfectly in the normal range, which is great, which means my diet and lifestyle, the way I live my life, is keeping my double MTHFR mutations in check. So that's cool. Liver function, alanine aminotransferase, bilirubin, gamma glutamyl transferase, all this other stuff, it's all normal. It's all fine. So all these liver enzymes, some of them have to do with bile duct function and things to do with gallbladder. It's all fine. Fairly boring there. Thyroid function, there's a rumor out there that a low carb diet for a female can cause disturbed thyroid or hypothyroid function, which is not the case for me, at least in this N1 experiment. My thyroid is totally fine. Free T4s on the high end of normal, thyroid stimulating hormone right in the middle of normal, so that's cool. Inflammation, some very unsubstantiated rumors out there that a high red meat diet would lead to chronic inflammation. Totally untrue, totally unjustified. My high sensitivity C-reactive protein is basically undetectable. Every blood work test I've had done comes back as less than 0.3, which basically means they can't measure it. So I have no inflammation in my body to speak of. My lipids, this is the interesting stuff. So my triglycerides are 1 millimolar. Now I live in Canada, so if you're watching this from the US, you might notice that you measure in milligrams per deciliter. So the numbers are a bit different. This is all in Canadian. My HDL-C, so that's considered your good cholesterol, on the high end of normal, triglycerides on the low end of normal. My LDL-C, 5.96, that's very high. That's very high above the reference range, which would possibly be a cause for concern, but we're going to talk more about what to read into these lipid levels, especially in conjunction with everything else. So one of the first things we're going to look at is the triglyceride to HDL ratio. So triglycerides are the fats floating around in your blood. You do not want to have energy floating around in your bloodstream. You don't want to have high glucose. You don't want to have high triglycerides. There should not be excess energy floating around in your bloodstream. So my triglycerides were low and my HDL was very high, which is a good thing. So this is from one doctor's website where they show triglyceride to HDL-C ratio less than 0.87 is ideal. Mine's even lower than that at 0.66. So I have good high HDL, nice low triglycerides. It means all the energy that's floating around and transported in my blood is making its way somewhere to be stored or used. That very high level of LDL, quite outside the reference range, combined with some of the other characteristics, very low blood glucose, very low fat mass, very low percentage of body fat, makes me one of Dave Feldman's lean mass hyperresponders, which is kind of cool. So he's got tons and tons of information on his website called the Cholesterol Code to dig into these weird anomalies, people like me, lean, healthy, fit people that embark on a very low carb diet and end up with very, very high levels of LDL. So I meet most of the diagnostic criteria, often lean with very low body fat, usually moderate to very fit. I will give myself a moderate on that one, and usually very low carb. And as this blood work was done after, ended up being more than a month by the time I got in to do my blood work, about 6 weeks of a meat-only diet. That's the ultimate in super low carb. So now, not only am I not concerned about having high LDL, I'm actually quite happy with it. There are many situations where having higher levels of cholesterol, in particular LDL cholesterol, could be advantageous. So this is a study that showed that the lower your cholesterol, the higher your chance of being admitted to a hospital with an infectious disease, the higher your rate of getting sepsis. There's a genetic condition called familial hypercholesterolemia, where people have genetically very, very high cholesterol. And it's been conserved in the human genome multiple times throughout our evolution. And if there was no way that this conferred an advantage, it wouldn't have happened multiple times over and over. So one of the working theories is that high levels of cholesterol, in particular LDL cholesterol, help suppress infection, help suppress bacterial and septic infections, which in times where people were drinking possibly contaminated water or eating contaminated food, this would have been very, very advantageous. So to have high LDL cholesterol, I think, can make you more robust in fighting off infections. There's also evidence that high LDL in females is inversely correlated with all-cause mortality. So your chances of being alive 10 years from now is better if you have higher LDL, especially in women. Cholesterol is also a very important component of the structure of your brain. So as you get older, having higher cholesterol is associated with better cognitive functioning, memory tests, less chance of Alzheimer's and all that sort of thing. So for a variety of reasons, better protection against infection, better outcomes on all-cause mortality, and better protection of my brain as I get much older, I'm perfectly fine with having super high LDL. So blood glucose. There was a fasting blood glucose done on my blood work, but that's just a snapshot from a moment in time. This I thought was more interesting, as this was the data from 2 weeks worth of a continuous glucose monitor implanted in my arm, where my average blood glucose was 3.9. I believe that works out to about 70 milligrams per deciliter in American units. So nice and low. My diabetes risk, my HbA1c, my glycated hemoglobin. This number represents the percentage of your red blood cells that have been glycated. So a red blood cell stays alive for about 90 to maybe 120 days. So how much that red blood cell has been exposed to sugar, as in high glucose in your blood, will be reflected in how many of them are glycated. The process of glycation is basically being covered in sugar. Sugar is quite sticky, so it's not a good thing if your red blood cells become glycated. So mine was 5.2, which is nice and low. The average or reference range there is between 4.5 and 6.5. Mine's on the lower end. So this 3 or 4 months of glycated hemoglobin data, the last 6 weeks before the blood work, I'd been super strict carnivore. The month prior to that, I'd been on a big trip with friends and family in New Zealand and Hawaii and enjoying much more stuff way off the normal. So for my HbA1c from that 3 or 4 month window to be quite low, I'm happy with that. Insulin. Now this was one I had to request, and I have not done this one before, so I have no other baseline to reference here. I had to request a fasting insulin test from my doctor, and she was actually quite surprised that I requested that one. And she said, "Oh, I've only ever requested that a handful of times before." So I thought that was surprising. Anyway, my fasting insulin, less than 14.4, and this is in, again, Canadian units. So the reference range there is 43 to 194. So my fasting insulin is very fantastically low, which is great. And this is actually the number that really matters. So blood glucose is interesting, especially average blood glucose from an implant. Insulin is what matters. You can have normal, stable blood glucose for years and years and years, but what's going on in the background is high levels of insulin required to maintain that glucose in its normal window. High fasting insulin would give you evidence of mounting metabolic syndrome years, maybe decades before you actually become symptomatic in terms of high fasting glucose, high HbA1cs. Especially with athletes, they can be particularly subjected to insulin resistance, which you would not think. You would think these specimens of fitness and athletic achievements, runners and CrossFitters and weightlifters and all these people, you would think they would never be at risk for insulin resistance, but they absolutely are. I think it's imperative that any athlete, especially an athlete fueling their fitness on a high carbohydrate diet, needs to request a fasting insulin test from their doctor. And if you see this number elevated, you need to really seriously reassess the way you're eating and treating your body. The other ratio here, this HOMA insulin resistance index, this is a homeostatic model assessment of insulin resistance. It's a ratio of fasting insulin to glucose. And what they want is a number less than 1 means you're insulin sensitive, which is optimal. So mine was 0.4, which is fantastic. Means I'm highly insulin sensitive, means my pancreas has to secrete very little insulin to get the job done. Other signs of insulin resistance: fasting glucose between 4.2 and 5.3. My average glucose, including when I eat, is 3.9, so that's not a problem. Triglyceride to HDL ratio near 1. Mine was 0.66. Fasting insulin between 18 and 48. Mine's even below that at 14.4. HbA1cs less than 5.6. Mine was 5.2. That glucose, insulin, HOMA-IR number near 1. Mine was 0.4. And total body fat less than 32% for women. I had a DEXA scan back in 2018. It's about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago now. And my percentage of body fat was 18%. I'm leaner now than I was then, so I would guess it would be a percentage or 2 lower than that. So am I insulin resistant? Not a chance, basically. What about metabolic syndrome? The big boogeyman that everybody's worried about, the cause of 70% of deaths these days, chronic disease. The diagnostic criteria to be diagnosed with metabolic syndrome is you have to meet any 3 of these 5. You have to have high blood pressure, greater than 130/85. I, if anything, have blood pressure on the low end. I'm usually like 100/60, sometimes in the 50s. High blood glucose levels, average over 5.6. Mine was 3.9. High triglycerides. I have low triglycerides. Mine was 1.0. Low HDL cholesterol. I have high HDL cholesterol. Mine was 1.51. A large waist circumference. I just had to measure myself. Mine is 70 centimeters, so also fine. So do I have metabolic syndrome? Not a chance. So in summary, after more than a month of eating nothing but animal foods, my electrolytes are normal. My nutrients are normal, B12, vitamin D. My homocysteine is normal. Amazing considering I'm homozygous for MTHFR. My organs, my liver, my gallbladder, normal. Thyroid, normal. Inflammation, none. Triglyceride to HDL ratio, awesome. LDL, very high, but that likely makes me a lean mass hyperresponder. Blood glucose, low and stable. Diabetes risk, none. Insulin, awesomely low. Chance of being insulin resistant, non-existent. Metabolic syndrome, not a chance. So thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer. Thanks.